Okay, we're good.
Let's see. All right, I'm going to wait one more minute. All right, so I think that we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Psychology Speaker Series on Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity. We appreciate your joining us for the second event of the spring. And I know that we cannot see each other so easily on the webinar, but please know that you are in the company of 33 people in attendance today so far. And we're so glad to have you with us virtually. My name is Kate Yang, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Stockton University. And along with my colleagues, Dr. Zornitsa Kalibatsiva and Dr. Christine Ferry, we co-organized the Psychology Speaker Series. This series presents research and theorizing from the field of psychology on racism and bias, experiences connected to race and ethnicity, multicultural awareness, as well as highlighting diverse representation within the field of psychology. You are in for a treat today. Dr. Griffin's presentation will chronicle and highlight the history and contributions of noted African-American psychologists from Arkansas in the areas of psychology, education, and social justice. Their achievements not only transformed psychology, but also changed history. During the presentation, Dr. Ferry and I will be monitoring the Q&A. So we encourage you to add your questions anytime to the Q&A or the chat, but we will hold the questions until the Q&A session at the end. And now I'm pleased to introduce my colleague in psychology and a co-organizer of today's event, Dr. Anthony Austin. Dr. Austin is a visiting assistant professor of psychology at Stockton University, and he teaches health psychology, statistical methods, and experimental psychology. His previous appointment was at the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff, where he was involved in the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals and the Arkansas Psychological Association. And it is through his connection that we were fortunate to meet Dr. Griffin. Thank you, Dr. Austin, for introducing us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Yang, for that introduction. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Griffin, who I've known since 2015, when I was, as you mentioned, a faculty member at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, which is a historically Black university. And that year, I became a member of the Arkansas Psychological Association and the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals, and that's when I met Dr. Griffin. And since I met her and I've known her, she's been extremely generous with her time to help inspire future generations of psychologists. And so, for example, she traveled the 45 minutes to an hour south to UAPB from Little Rock, Arkansas, on more than one occasion to have conversations with our students about how African-American psychologists from Arkansas helped to shape the history of the entire field of psychology. She also worked with individual students to help mentor them in developing their own careers, and has just been very, very generous. Dr. Griffin is a clinical psychologist who has had a prolific academic and professional career. She was the first African-American to receive a PhD in psychology at the University of Arkansas, where she then became a faculty member. She subsequently held faculty positions at El Paso Community College in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and was also chair of the Department of Psychology at Philander Smith College in Little Rock, Arkansas. Dr. Griffin has also held numerous clinical positions. She maintains her own private practice, Clinical Psychology Services Incorporated in Little Rock. Formerly, she held positions as Director of Psychological Services for Adolescent Inpatient Treatment for the Arkansas Mental Health Services Division, and Director of South Pulaski Services for Central Arkansas Mental Health Services, among others. She has also served and promoted the field of psychology as past president of both the Arkansas Psychological Association and the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals, and has served on numerous committees within those organizations. For example, she's former chair of the Arkansas Psychological Association's Diversity Committee. She's also a member of the American Psychological Association and the Association of Black Psychology, the Association of Black Psychologists. And so through these organizations, she has been active in promoting mental health awareness in her community and throughout the country. She has also been recipient of many grants to host diversity and racial awareness conferences, as well as a conference for parenting African-American children. And I can go on and on and on with more. Dr. Griffin has also done this, and Dr. Griffin has also done that, but I don't want to take up any more of her time. And as I mentioned, she's very generous with her time and knowledge, and so it's our great privilege to have her with us today as part of our Psychology Speaker Series. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Patricia Griffin.
Thank you, Dr. Austin, for that gracious introduction. I'm very humbled by that introduction. And good afternoon, Stockton University. Greetings from Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock, Arkansas. Thanks to Zoom, we were able to connect across the distance to enable me to be with you today. It is certainly a privilege for me to have been chosen as your 2021 spring speaker for your Race, Ethnicity, and Diversity series. I have been looking forward to this day. Special thanks to Dr. Kate Yang for coordinating all of the details of my visits. We've Zoomed, we've emailed, and hopefully everything is ready to go. Special thanks to the technical support department and also to Ms. Denise Green for her administrative support. As Dr. Austin mentioned, we worked together when he was here in Arkansas, and we still miss you, Dr. Austin. We miss you here in Arkansas, and thank you for your service during your tenure here at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. I have chosen to speak with you today on this topic, Transformational Influences in America by African American Psychologists from Arkansas. African American psychologists born in the state of Arkansas have an extensive history of transformational influences in the fields of psychology, education, and social justice. These contributions have been significant and a benefit not only to Arkansas, but to our nation as a whole. These contributions and influences also parallel the trajectory of the civil rights movement in our country. Sadly, there is no single body of work that singularly documents the identity and contributions of these African-American psychologists. The crisis of 1957 has in many ways overshadowed the history of Blacks in Arkansas, with images of those 9 brave young students protected by the National Guard who entered the halls of Central High School. Unknown are the contributions during that time made by psychologist Mamie Phipps Clarke from Hot Springs, Arkansas, who played a significant role in history. This presentation will chronicle and highlight that history. The history of African-American psychologists from Arkansas, their contributions, achievements, and influences. These objectives will serve to frame my presentation today. In addition to tracing the history, the objective would be to raise awareness of the significant contributions in those 3 fields that I mentioned. Parallel the history to transformational changes in America, highlight the contributions of Dr. Robert L. Williams through the 10-point program, and also present a case for infusing the history of African-American psychologists into psychology training program curriculum. For just a few seconds, I would like for you to reflect with me on this quotation by the late Dr. Asa Hilliard, African-American psychologist. There is something wrong with a psychology and psychological analysis that leaves African descent people strangers to themselves, aliens to their culture, oblivious to their condition, and inhumane to their oppressors. Just take a second to reflect on that quotation, please. These are 2 references that I highly recommend for additional reading. The classic work by Robert Guthrie, Even the Rat Was White, A Historical View of Psychology, which also chronicles the contributions of noted African-American psychologists in America, not just Arkansas. And The History of the Association of Black Psychologists by Dr. Robert L. Williams, and we'll hear more about him later on during today's presentation. Francis Cecil Sotner, father of Black psychology. Sotner was born on December the 7th, 1895 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, 30 years after slavery, and his parents were actually slaves. Francis Cecil Sotner became the first Black American to receive a PhD in psychology on June the 14th, 1920, from Clarke University in Massachusetts. His parents, like many parents during that time, left Arkansas in order to improve or have access to better educational opportunities for their 2 sons. For the elementary school years, Sotner attended schools in Norfolk, Virginia, and Plainfield, New Jersey. He lived in New Jersey for a while. After the elementary school years, he did not attend high school, but was homeschooled by his parents, who used old textbooks for instructional purposes. In 1911, at the age of 15, he passed a written exam and was enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. While at Lincoln University, Sotner became acquainted with James P. Porter, professor of psychology and dean of the college at Clarke University, and also G. Stanley Hall. And you psychology majors will recognize that name. G. Stanley Hall was president of Clarke University and later became the first president of the American Psychological Association. He then completed a second bachelor's degree from Clarke, and this was in June of 1916. He returned to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania to complete a master's degree and developed a growing interest in psychology. With the assistance of G. Stanley Hall, he was admitted to Clarke University to the PhD program in clinical psychology. His educational training, however, was interrupted because he was drafted in the U.S. Army and served honorably during World War I. And he is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. After he completed his tour of duty in the Army, Sotner returned to Clarke University and became the first American to receive the PhD in clinical psychology there at Clarke University in Massachusetts. The title of his dissertation was Psychoanalysis of Freud and Adler. Sotner in 1928 joined the faculty of Howard University in Washington, D.C., and became chair of that department. Sadly, on January the 12th, 1954, at the young age of 59, he died while shoveling snow in front of his house. Francis Cecil Sotner was chair of the Howard University Department of Psychology when Mamie Catherine Phipps Clarke enrolled as an undergraduate student. Mamie Phipps Clarke was born on October 18, 1917, in the resort town of Hot Springs, Arkansas. She attended segregated public schools and graduated from segregated Langston High School. She later became the first African-American female to complete a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. And this was in 1943. The title of her dissertation was Changes in Primary Mental Abilities with Age. Clarke was very privileged. Her father was a physician in Hot Springs, and her parents owned a spa. Hot Springs is noted for its hot springs, natural hot springs that are piped into bathhouses, and people come from all over the country for these medicinal purposes that they receive from these bathhouses. And her parents were owners of one of those spas. Everything, of course, was segregated. After graduating from high school, she enrolled at Howard University in DC with plans of majoring in mathematics and physics. Unfortunately, and maybe not so unfortunate after all, due to prejudices against women entering math and physics at that time, she was not supported by her professors. While at Howard, she met Kenneth B. Clarke and was encouraged to change her major to psychology. She completed her bachelor's degree in psychology in 1938, graduating magna cum laude. She also completed her master's degree at Howard University. And following the summer after her first year in the master's degree program, became employed as a secretary in the law firm of William Houston. While working in that office, she met Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall, as you may recall, was the first African-American appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. He and other legal activists were involved in preparing civil rights cases that culminated in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. Her thesis was the development of consciousness in Negro preschool children, completed in 1939, and demonstrated that Black children become aware of their racial identity at about age 3, and simultaneously with their awareness of racial identity, acquired a negative self-image. The pioneering research completed 15 years before the Brown versus Board of Education decision paved the way for her psychological research to be used in court cases and the desegregation of schools around the country. Mamie Phipps Clarke and her husband, Kenneth Clarke, studied the effect of segregation and racism on the self-esteem of Black children. And here you see photos of that classic doll study conducted by Mamie Phipps Clarke and her husband. And this was a study that contributed to the US Supreme Court ruling, which determined racial segregation in public education was unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren drafted the Brown v. Board of Education opinion. And I will read this quotation that was written as a part of that decision. To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Even the end of quotation. This groundbreaking decision led to the desegregation of schools around the country and to the crisis of 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I want to show a clip. Sadly, many students do not learn about this history. And this clip, this video clip, this brief clip, will give you a snapshot of the landscape at that time. This is 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up? If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
That we are an enlightened society, free from problems of race, gender, or economic separation. But some of the most difficult lessons we learn are a result of individuals who push us through these divisive barriers. In September of 1957, 9 oldest only 17, forced us through such a blockade. They sought a better education for themselves and the opportunity to pursue the American dream.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school, under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now for their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
We were Terence Roberts and Thomas, Thelma Mothershed, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Carlotta Walls, Melba Patillo, Minnie Jean Brown, and Gloria Ray.
They became known as the Little Rock Nine. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on universal education found segregation of schools unconstitutional. But as the Little Rock Nine approached the high school, segregationists swarmed the campus.
I got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They are their own.
As the violence escalated, one schoolgirl, Elizabeth Eckford, was threatened by an angry mob chanting, "Lynch her, lynch her." President Dwight Eisenhower intervened in Little Rock and set a precedent for our nation as a whole.
Such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
On September 25th, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs and made their way to the classrooms at Little Rock Central High School.
Just got a report here on this end that the students are in.
You feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward and in doing so alter the course of history. Marquette University is honored to bestow upon them the Pierre Marquette Discovery Award for this extraordinary contribution to the advancement of education for all people. The Little Rock Nine stand not just for racial equality, but also for the promise upon which our society is founded: opportunity and equality for all willing to strive, struggle, and achieve.
The crisis of 1957. There were 9 students who started that school year. There were only 8 who completed the school year. As you can tell from the clip, the tension was high. The Little Rock Nine were subjected to bullying, trauma on a daily basis. And one of the Little Rock Nine retaliated such that she was not only expelled from Central High School, but by order of the governor of the state of Arkansas, Orville Phillips, was expelled from attending any high school in the state. Dr. Clarke was an advisor to Ms. Daisy Bates, who was the coordinator and advisor for these Little Rock Nine. And she and her husband, Dr. Kenneth Clarke, took Minnie Jean Brown in their home. And the picture at the top left shows Minnie Jean Brown in her home, in the home of the Clarks, rather. To your left is Dr. Clarke, Dr. Kenneth Clarke. This is Mamie Clarke, Dr. Mamie Clarke, their two children. And this is Minnie Jean here. The picture at the bottom right shows Minnie Jean along with her mother, Dr. Mamie Clarke, and Kate, their daughter, when they arrived in New York. Minnie Jean graduated from New York's New Lincoln School in Manhattan in 1959. The Clarks are also noted for opening the Northside Center for Child Development, where they made important contributions to the understanding and treatment of problems of African-American children. And as I walk you through this history, I want you to see how the dots are connected. Dr. Francis Cecil Sotner and Dr. Mamie Phipps Clarke represent what I have categorized as the first era of psychologists from Arkansas. The second generation of the second era of Black psychologists from Arkansas begins with Dr. Robert L. Williams, my mentor. Dr. Williams defied all odds as a Black male born in the segregated South. He was born in a small town called Biscoe, Arkansas on February the 20th, 1930. And at the age of 5, his father, who was a millwright, died, leaving his mother as a single parent with 2 children. His mother was a domestic worker and was working in the home of a white family when she died on Dr. Williams' birthday, February the 20th, 1978. And at the time, he was teaching a class at Washington University. Dr. Williams graduated from Dunbar High School at the age of 16. And when he was in the 10th grade, he was given an IQ test and scored 82. Well, Dr. Williams thought that that was passing. Later to learn that he only missed the classification of mental retardation, which was the diagnostic category used at that time, by a few points. As a result of his low score on the IQ test, he was advised to pursue a career in masonry. And he enrolled in the vocational trade program, took such courses as mechanics, bricklaying, electricity, and carpentry. He said he managed to get into an English class or 2, math class, science class, but he was in the vocational trade curriculum. He later enrolled at Dunbar Junior College, dropped out, and at the age of 18 married his childhood sweetheart, and they were almost married 70 years before she passed, and they are the parents of 8 children. After he became a husband and a father, he decided to return to college, where he enrolled at Philander Smith College, graduated in 1953 with honors, distinction in his field, ranked 5th in his class. His major was sociology, and his minor was psychology. He completed 2 masters. The first one was in 1955 at Wayne State in educational psychology. And then in 1961, he became the first African-American psychologist to complete a PhD at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Williams had a stellar career in psychology. Because of racial segregation at the time, after he completed Philander, there was no graduate program in the South that would admit him as an African-American student. And this is when he and Mrs. Williams moved to Detroit, where in 1955, he obtained the master's degree from Wayne State. He decided to return to Arkansas in June of 1955 and became the first African-American licensed psychologist at the master's level in June of that year. Again, connecting the dots, it was Governor Phipps who signed Act 129 into law to legislate the practice of psychology in the state of Arkansas. This was done in May of 1955, and the next month, Dr. Williams passed the test. His first job was at the Arkansas State Hospital as a staff psychologist, and this was in 1955. He was there for a couple of years, and tension was rising because of the move to desegregate schools around the country. Until that time, he was allowed to dine in the white dining area with the white psychologists. But with the onset of the tension of 1957, he was advised to eat in a separate dining hall, which he refused and ate lunch instead at his desk. He was also encouraged by one of the staff psychologists at the state hospital to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology, which he did. And in 1957, he enrolled, being the first African-American, in the psychology department at Washington University in St. Louis. Time does not permit me to go through all of his noteworthy appointments, many of whom were positions for the first time for an African-American to hold. Dr. Williams started Washington University again during the crisis of 1957 in Little Rock, and in 1961 completed his PhD. I do want to highlight some of his appointments. He was a consultant for NIMH. He worked initially in San Francisco, later in Alaska, traveled throughout most of Alaska, conducted studies in multicultural psychology before the area was recognized by the American Psychological Association. He was in Anchorage, Alaska on April the 4th, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. With the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Williams stated that he went through a personal transformation. It was at that time that he developed a strong sense of racial pride and Black consciousness and underwent a conversion from Negroness to Blackness. At 38, he had a PhD, a highly esteemed position with NIMH, a wife, 8 children. He was a property owner, holder of 3 advanced degrees, and was usually the first to integrate a community. Dr. Williams described this phase of his life as buying into the Euro-American standards and norms. As a result of this transformation, Dr. Williams became one of the founding members of the Association of Black Psychologists, director of the African American Studies program at Washington University, coined the term Ebonics, and this was in 1973. Ebonics was part of his studies on the cognitive and language development of Black children. And I want to qualify this by saying Ebonics is not slang, it's not vernacular, but it is a linguistic system by African Americans using various languages from Africa, combined with English for communication purposes. Dr. Williams studied and researched Black personality theory through the lens of African philosophy rather than a European lens, and challenged the misuse of IQ testing with Black children, of which he had been a victim. He was a pioneer in the areas of diversity and multicultural psychology before the area again was recognized by the American Psychological Association. He researched biases in testing, made several media appearances. As a part of his criticism of IQ testing and its misuse with children of color, he developed the Black intelligence test of cultural homogeneity, which demonstrated that African-American students perform better on culture fair tests. Dr. Williams contributed to mentoring students, early career psychologists, and psychologists well established in the field until a few months before his death at the age of 90 in August of 2020. His last two books were Raising Black Kids to Be Okay and Racism Learned at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting. One of the many quotes made by Dr. Williams is this: "Do not forget to give back to the community that birthed you. Do not forget to give back to the community that birthed you." And Dr. Williams did not forget the Arkansas community nor the African American community. When Dr. Williams was president of the Association of Black Psychologists, he drafted what is called the 10-point program. And this opened doors for the first generation of African Americans to enroll in departments of psychology throughout the country. At that time, stamps cost 6 cents. He mailed 365 letters to universities around the country to their Department of Psychology, and 65 signed on, among which was the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And as a result, through the 10-point program, I became the first African-American to receive a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arkansas. Many other African-Americans became the first to complete the PhD in universities around the country because of this groundbreaking work of Dr. Robert L. Williams. Time does not permit me to go into this program in detail, but I would encourage you to research this. A part of the second generation is also Dr. Terence Roberts, and you heard his voice on that video clip. Dr. Terence Roberts was one of the Little Rock Nine, who became a well-known psychologist. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas, when he enrolled at Central, he was a junior. He was not able to complete his senior year because Phipps closed down the high schools in Little Rock, and he and his family they moved to California, where he completed high school at Los Angeles High School. He also completed MSW in social work in 1970. He had plans of going into social work initially, however, changed his career path to psychology. And what an outstanding career he's had in the field of psychology. He completed his PhD in psychology from Southern Illinois in Carbondale, and he has held various faculty positions. He's been director of psychiatric hospitals, chair of departments of psychology. He is currently the CEO of Terence J. Roberts and Associates, a management consulting firm, very active in the area of racial diversity and racism, has authored 2 books, Lessons from Little Rock, and also Simple Not Easy, Reflections on Community, Social Responsibility, and Tolerance. He was involved with the State Department as an international consultant with civil unrest and conflict resolution in the Middle East, and this was a few years ago. Dr. Roberts and Dr. Williams represent that second generation. And here are photos of the Little Rock Nine that you saw in the video clip. The person standing here is Mrs. Daisy Bates, who is their advisor, and this is Dr. Terence Roberts, and seated here is Minnie Jean Brown. And 8 of the 9 are still living. Now we are at the 3rd generation of Black psychologists from Arkansas. Thanks to the groundbreaking social advocacy work of the 1st and 2nd generations, Black psychologists from Arkansas have been able to change the landscape. Many Arkansans left the state to pursue graduate training, and many of them have not been identified. We have the largest number of African Americans now in the state, and this has changed significantly within the past 20 years. These numbers change, but approximately 3.4% of the licensed psychologists are Black, 37 Black psychologists roughly, 27% are at the master's level, and 73% at the doctoral level. Many of them are in training roles or in supervisory roles. The trajectory, the landscape is slowly changing. And this is a graph that depicts the range of settings of the Black psychologists now in Arkansas, to include academia, clinical settings, inpatient hospitalization, inpatient hospital settings, private practice. We have our 1st generation of psychologists at the Veterans Administration, community mental health centers, school psychologists, criminal justice, at the Med Center, and we have a couple of retirees, and they are very pleased to be retired, but they are still actively involved. I invite you to visit our Facebook page, AABPP Facebook page, and AABPP YouTube page. On February the 28th, 2020, before the outbreak of COVID-19, our association hosted a centennial commemoration honoring and recognizing the historical contributions of African-American psychologists from Arkansas. And that is open to the public domain, and I would encourage you to take some time to view that. Those who are recognized are Francis Cecil Sotner, Mamie Phipps Clarke, Dr. Robert L. Williams, and Dr. William Sterling Hall, who was the first African-American on the faculty in the Department of Psychology at Princeton and retired from the University of Maryland, College Park. This is a picture from that commemoration. We honored Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, standing here next to Dr. Terence Roberts, who is our keynote speaker. Also included in this photo are the 3 first African Americans to graduate with a PhD in psychology from the University of Arkansas. This person is Dr. Harriet Richard, on the faculty at Johnson C. Smith, and she was the first PhD to complete the applied experimental program. And standing behind me is the first African-American male to complete the PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arkansas. That was quite an eventful day. This history poses certain challenges and implications for educational purposes and also for training. And as I wrap up the presentation, I want to leave some thoughts, challenges for reflection. Black psychologists from Arkansas and other states have contributed to the field, not only by those I have presented today, but many, many others. And this history, of course, needs to be preserved. There is a need for this history to be integrated into the psychological pedagogy. This history is critical for developing cultural competency and for training future psychologists. I tell my colleagues that we don't have enough African-American psychologists to meet the needs of the African-American community. And we need culturally competent psychologists across the spectrum to meet the pressing needs that we see so evident within our country and particularly within the African American community. So the question is, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And these are some questions I would like for you to ponder. To what degree do we integrate issues pertaining to African American psychology and clinical practice, supervision of trainees and teaching? To what degree do we appropriately challenge organization systemic structural variables that disregard these culturally relevant issues? What is the culture of workplaces, programs, and civil professional organizations regarding these issues? What are the next steps? Thank you for being receptive to this history. And now I will turn the discussion back to Dr. Yang for questions and discussion. Dr. Yang.
Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin, for this wonderfully informative and inspiring presentation and for the challenges that you posed for us. So as I thought about those challenges, I thought that there is still a long way for us to go as an institution and for psychology, the discipline of psychology, to go in integrating and including the contributions and the legacy of African American psychologists in our field. So right now I'm going to again welcome everyone to type in your questions, your comments into the Q&A or into the chat. I'm also going to, as folks are thinking about their questions or typing their questions, I'm going to drop the link to the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals Facebook page into the chat. And I welcome you to visit the Facebook page and explore just an outstanding compendium of resources and events, including the Mindful Minute conversation series and the town hall events and conversations that feature resources and events and expert discussions of mental health, COVID, physical wellness, community culture, as well as anti-racism. Okay, so I'm going to drop that into the chat. And Dr. Ferry and Dr. Austin, I also welcome you to contribute your questions for Dr. Griffin.
I do have a question, Dr. Griffin. And so you said there's approximately 3.4% of psychology professionals in Arkansas are African American. That's been increasing in the past 20 years. So what was it just 20 years ago? And also, that still doesn't seem like it's representative of the African American population in Arkansas. And so how much further does that need to go?
Thank you, Dr. Austin, and you are absolutely correct. We are underrepresented. Arkansas's African American population is about 16%. Of course, African Americans are underrepresented in the field of psychology throughout this country, not just in Arkansas. 20 years ago, you could count the number of African American psychologists on one hand. There were 5 or fewer. And that, again, was because of the lack of opportunities, the lack of admissions to the departments of the graduate schools in psychology. That is slowly changing, but it's not changing fast enough. We are still few in number. Excellent question.
We've got one comment in the Q&A, a attendee who remembers learning about the doll study of Dr. Clarke and how it felt sad, how people don't acknowledge or recognize or know about the study. I'd love to hear in the chat, in our audience, who is probably mostly students, did you learn about Dr. Clarke's doll study in Intro to Psych or in any of your psychology classes? Is that something you've ever heard of? You can just say yes or no in the chat so we can see if you've learned about it so far in your undergrad classes. I think we've got some responses here, more yeses than nos, so that's good. And I think speaks to not only the importance of that research and how it impacts people when they learn about it, but I really appreciate, Dr. Griffin, you showing how that psychological research led to a Supreme Court decision that changed the system and structure in the United States in a way that made things more fair. That we have to do this work to make the changes that our society needs, and that's still happening now. That's still something that we need to do.
Absolutely. I think there is a need today as never before for psychologists to join forces with public policy, social advocacy, in the areas of social justice. Mm-hmm. We are actually seeing a return to the Jim Crow era across the country. And we see what is happening on the political scene. And this is also affecting the education of Black and Brown children. Nationwide, there is a resegregation of our schools. Just think about where you're located and the composition of your schools in your area. We are moving backwards in history. And education has always been a door of opportunity for African Americans to achieve or to aspire to achieve the American dream. One of the things that we as an association in Arkansas are beginning to look at the intersectionality of psychology and social justice. There's so many implications for us in the field of psychology to look at areas such as poverty, mental illness, which is prevalent with COVID-19. We're seeing an increase in the suffering of all of us, the nation as a whole, and particularly communities of Black and Brown individuals. There's a lot of suffering, and there are a lot of opportunities for psychology to interface with social advocacy, social justice initiatives, to look at ways of changing the landscape, ways of changing the system. And it starts in colleges, universities of higher education. Just as an aside, I want to mention that Dr. Kenneth Clarke was the first African-American to be president of the American Psychological Association. We have had others since then, but he is the only African-American male who is president, and he was the first.
Thank you. We have a question from an attendee. Out of all of your contributions to the field of psychology, which are you most proud of?
Well, thank you for attributing all of my contributions. I am humbled by that because the needs are so great. I welcome the opportunity to work with associations. I enjoy my private practice. I have been in private practice, I won't tell you exactly how many years, but for a number of years. I was able to transition to telehealth, and I come to my office every day and see patients by telehealth. And I'm humbled by the opportunity to partner with individuals who are suffering to alleviate their distress. But I'm also grateful for the opportunity to work in the community through our associations. Not only am I actively involved in the Arkansas Association of Black Psychology Professionals, I am equally involved with the Arkansas Psychological Association. It's very important for those of us who have a calling for social advocacy to work within our associations. And I have been very pleased with the work that the Arkansas Psychological Association has done in the area of social justice and being able to have open discussion about racism. Just last fall, we had a workshop on racism in the therapy room. Mm-hmm. And bringing those topics to the table and looking at ways to have conversation can be very important in breaking through some of those barriers, but someone has to be the voice at the table. And I welcome the opportunity to be the voice at the table. I guess it's difficult to say one area over others. Psychologists offer, the field of psychology offers so many opportunities to make an impact in not only the lives of individuals, but also the lives of systems. And I like doing both.
That's great. We have Natalie who talked about the influence of low representation and the doll study. I'm not sure exactly what time Natalie made her comment, feeling like she doesn't have a place in psychology as underrepresented. And Anthony asking also, do you see this underrepresentation in other races and ethnicities, Asian cultures, Latino community? I know I had a friend who is a clinical psychologist who speaks Thai, and when she was on Psychology Today, because she speaks the language and she was the only psychologist, on the Psychology Today search, was, the only opportunity to speak in native language and get, professional psychological treatment. So I've certainly known of that. So it looks like we have a lot of places where we need to grow.
Absolutely, absolutely. And all racial ethnic groups are underrepresented. There is a need, a calling. And one of the beauties, I think, of these opportunities are ways that we can collaborate together. The American Psychological Association is doing that, bringing racial ethnic groups together to collaborate. That strengthens our call and cause. We're also doing this here in Arkansas through the Arkansas Psychological Association, as well as AABPP. AABPP is not exclusive just to Black psychologists. Dr. Austin was a member. Thank you, Dr. Austin, and was very active in the association. And we have members of the Asian American community. We have a diverse group. We're a small group, but we have been very impactful in bringing psychology into the public setting, presenting a diverse, unified picture.
That's great. It leads actually nicely to Dr. Lake's question. She's on our psychology faculty and would love for you to share some ideas about programs can encourage African-American students to choose psychology as a major, to pursue graduate school in psychology. What can we do in our curriculum, in our faculty, to try to help students feel interested and welcome?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't have time to go into that in detail. But in terms of encouraging African-American students to go into the field of psychology, it helps if they can see the face of other African-American psychologists. When I was at Philander Smith College, I brought in as many African-American psychologists from the state of Arkansas that I could. And they represented a cross-section of professionals in various areas, because I wanted our students, Philander Smith College is HBCU, I wanted our students to see their face in the face of others. We had those from the medical school as a part of that career day. We had those in academia, those from the VA, first generation VA, community mental health center, state agencies, private practice. It was a full day. I think that was before Dr. Austin was with us, but we had one of the professors from UAPP, Dr. Abote, that Dr. Austin remembers. But that is a wonderful opportunity for students to have face-to-face contact with models in the field. And to establish a relationship, mentoring is very important as well. And I created, when I was the chair of the department, I created an avenue whereby our students could connect with psychologists in the community, not just psychologists in the department. And they were accessible. They would meet with them. I've had students from other schools to contact me to be a mentor. And I have welcomed that opportunity because we're all committed to this cause. So sponsoring something like Psychology Day for not just African Americans, but for areas in which ethnic racial groups are underrepresented is a wonderful starting point. And bringing those psychologists into your university to support this initiative as well.
That's helpful. That's great. Thank you. I've got a perhaps final question from CJ asking, what do you think is the best approach to changing the stigma around mental health and seeking mental health treatment in the Black community?
That's a great question. You all are coming up with such great questions, and I regret that I don't have time to delve into this, but I want to share with you what is happening at medical school. We have a young African-American psychologist who is working with an initiative along with a psychiatric nurse. They're assistant and associate professors at UAMS. They were able to get a grant whereby they have taken mental health into the community, and they don't call it mental health, they call it emotional health. Mm-hmm. For the past few years, they have been working in rural areas of the state. Arkansas is primarily rural. And they have interfaced with faith leaders in the communities. Mm-hmm. They have partnered with faith leaders, pastors. Pastors are the doorkeepers for mental distress in their communities. Pastors for many years have been the go-to person for personal problems or family problems. And through this initiative, they have empowered these ministers. They usually have conferences throughout the year. And I'm just amazed with these ministers who come in and talk psychology so competently. They are the greatest promoters of taking care of your emotional health. So working at a grassroots level is very important. And one of our initiatives through AABPP was to bring in different faith leaders. And we had ministers who drove an hour and a half to come in for a meeting at 6:30. They are committed, they have bought in because they see the need. Yeah. And that has made such an impact in our state. There is, I think when you, again, connect with the community, with leaders in the community, they can become advocates for promoting health and well-being. There is one event that we had this Monday that has not been posted, so I would encourage you to access that later on in the month. We had the April series on the power of spirituality for coping during the dual pandemics. Mm-hmm. We had a minister who's also a physician, powerful, a psychiatrist who's also a faith leader, and looked at the intersection of spirituality and mental health. Mm-hmm. And they also brought in the science of mental health and spirituality. That is a powerful, powerful event. And I would encourage all of you within the next few weeks to visit our Facebook page and our YouTube page for that recording. And it's going all over the country.
That's wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. I think we're cleared through for questions from the chat and Q&A. I'll pass it back to Dr. Yang.
And I will also say that it was a wonderful panel that Dr. Griffin also moderated. I think I recall that in that panel, there was also a discussion of the COVID vaccine and community public health as well as mental health. So really, a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
This, again, this sounds like such an interesting and innovative initiative in connecting to communities. And I just wanted to wrap up by thanking Dr. Griffin for your thought-provoking and your inspiring presentation today, and for our discussion with our community. You've inspired us to act, to advocate, and to transform. And thank you to the audience members today for joining us. And so this will conclude today's event, and we wish everyone well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin.
Thank you. The time went by so fast.